Hello and welcome. My name is Francesca Borgo. I'm a scholar of early modern art from the University of St. Andrews. And today I'm interviewing Robert Brennan, who is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Art History at the University of Sydney. And we will be talking about his new book, Painting as Modern Art in Early Renaissance Italy, which was published by Harvey Miller in a new prestigious and beautifully illustrated book series that is devoted to early modern European art. Robert's book asks a fundamental, very bold, very big question. What did it mean for art to be modern before the period that we regard as modernity today? What did modern mean? How did modern look like in the 14th century? So I would like to start by asking Robert, what brought you to this topic? I know that you started your PhD and you were planning to focus on modern and contemporary art, but you ended up publishing your first book about the notion of modernity in the early Renaissance. So what happened? Can you tell us a bit about this intellectual trajectory?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for this kind introduction. There is definitely a connection, although in retrospect, it's kind of an adventure. I was working on 20th century art the first few years of grad school, and I had already gotten to the point of thinking about my dissertation topic and things like that. I wanted to write something about exhibitions, art exhibitions that had been staged in the ruins of World War II in the decades following the war, and how that, situation related to ideas about the end of modernism in the period. So those themes were kind of there. And I was actually doing research. I had gone to Berlin and I happened to go into the Bode Museum. And I just happened upon this little Italian plaquette, very small little bronze object. And in the background, there were these classical ruins, and in the foreground was Hercules. And at the top, this inscription that said, "O Moderni," which it's the artist actually went by the nickname Moderno. So it stands for a work by Moderno, or a work of a modern. Although at the time I didn't really know what it meant. And I thought, oh, is this like an exclamation, like, oh, moderns. I was just completely disoriented and kind of captivated by this notion that all of the themes that I was interested in were kind of contained in this, modest little work from hundreds of years earlier. And I had gone back and started looking into the history of the word, and it just kind of got better and better. In reference works and things like that, I could see that the earliest usages were kind of in the 5th century, early 6th century. And in many cases, or at least some prominent cases, were actually being used to describe the ruins of Rome, after the series of invasions in late antiquity. And so I kind of got this idea for this, grand project about, modern and the ruins in art, and, the ruins being somehow both kind of the cradle and the grave of this idea of modern art. And I had always had an interest in the Renaissance and early modern art. And so I, quickly gravitated to some of those sources and eventually kind of narrowed it down into this project as it is today.
That's great. So it's the encounter with the object that really triggered.
It was, and it was also just because of that, a very open-ended question, kind of this disorientation and curiosity about what this could possibly mean.
Exactly. And so since we are already talking about modernity within its double meaning, right? And this is how you open your book, you call attention to the fact that modernity is a term that we can use to refer to the now, to what is contemporary to us, but it can also refer or point to a fixed point of reference in the past, right? So it has always struck me how unstable and mutable the term is. In Italian academia, for example, modern art corresponds to what in Anglophone countries we would call early modern art. So it corresponds to Renaissance art, right? And I think this is a very powerful reminder of the fact that we're still sort of like working in the shade, working in the wake of Vasari and what he defined, Giorgio Vasari, and what he defined as being modern in the 16th century. So because the term is constantly shifting, do you think is it something that we need to be constantly reassessing, and do different understandings of modernity matter? Do they affect our own modernity today?
Yeah, great questions. And certainly this constant reassessment, I do think, is necessary. I think to some extent the notion of being modern, requires upkeep because of that instability that's kind of built into the term itself. You can kind of illustrate that etymologically. The word, this Latin word that I'm dealing with is modernus, and it's invented on the basis of this adverb modo, which just means now, like just now. So, from the beginning and all the way through the history of the word's use, it tends to gravitate towards the now. You can use it to describe something that just recently happened in an altogether kind of prosaic way, like without any kind of grand historical claims at all. And the exception to the rule, and the thing that is interesting to me, is when the word does kind of get hooked onto this fixed point in the past. Because that's when it really starts to reveal this, understanding of history. You can imagine the kind of, almost as if that now kind of gets extended through time, and it's a now that somehow people want to hold on to. And what I found in looking at this particular period in the 14th, early 15th century in Italy, is that it's not as if it just, the modern kind of got fixed to this one artist just as a matter of course, kind of naturally, as it were, just because, he was a great artist, which is certainly like an indispensable part of it.
You're referring to Giotto.
Exactly, to Giotto. But, in order to kind of retain Giotto's modernity, you did have this kind of group of very self-consciously kind of elite artists and intellectuals who, craft an idea of modernity that will fix it in place and fix it to Giotto, and that is actually not necessarily immediately intelligible to everybody else in the society.
So, and as a segue to this, perhaps, since we're talking about our modernity and the 14th century modernity, do you see any affinities between the two? Is there anything like a set of recurring traits that the modern always acquires? Anything like that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because this is something that gave me a lot of trouble over the course of my research, because the evidence that I was finding for the way they used the word really cut against my assumptions. I thought I was going to end up discovering some kind of completely unmodern way of being modern that had absolutely no recognizable, relation to modernism or any of the other kind of ways of thinking about modernity that we know today. And on the face of it, it's more complicated than that, because when you're reading these late medieval sources, they say to make an art modern, you put it on a new foundation in science and you rationalize it accordingly. You could almost imagine that just, on the face of those terms, as a kind of avant-garde mantra of some sort, or at least like certain, strains of 19th, 20th century art. But it's not quite as static as it seems as an idea, because at the same time, every one of those terms, art, science, obviously modernity itself, perhaps even kind of rationality, means something completely different in the 14th century than they do in the 20th. So what you have is this kind of stable constellation of ideas, which are getting constantly reinvented. And I think there is a lot to learn from that. I mean, on the one hand, it does kind of upset the notion that, you know, modernity springs, or modern art kind of springs directly from the conditions of modernity, that it's a kind of, you know, only possible to conceive after the scientific revolution, after the French Revolution, or whatever else you might want to link it to. On the other hand, there is this fact of extreme historical distance, which I think is useful because it allows you to see this kind of whole process of, you know, the modern getting linked to a certain moment, extending, and then ultimately kind of dissipating or crumbling away into something else. And there are certain parallels between the way that this discourse of modernity kind of comes to the end in the mid 15th century, and something like, you know, we could say like postmodernism. There's obviously big differences, but one of the main strategies that is used to kind of redirect and reorient and ultimately diffuse this idea of modernity is irony. And it's humanists who are really conscious about what that word means and where it comes from. They're aware of the fact that it's not a kind of classical Latin term, that it only arises later. But then at the same time, they're aware that the concept or something like it did exist further back in the past. And out of that kind of awareness, they create these kinds of very ironic rhetorical formulas that ultimately end up kind of turning the whole discourse around and making it so that if you're following Giotto, you're actually, you know, imitating the ancients.
Can we talk briefly about your second chapter, which I think is my favorite in the book? This is where you discuss cosmetics, makeup, and fashion even. You very convincingly demonstrate that to make modern for non-elite viewers, for common viewers in the 14th century, meant to beautify, right? To make more beautiful. So, and you show how the repainting of icons and paintings by the older generation was meant to improve the appearance of the figures especially. So also this focus on the human figure, which I think is very interesting as the privilege, right? Focus of painting. So to make figures more beautiful, to make them more fashionable according to the period standards of beauty. How is that different from what the classical idea of beauty was, right? From the sort of like the classical focus on the beautiful, proportioned, and idealized body. How is fashion and how is the 15th century beautiful different from that?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, that divide, I think, does open up as a result of this this tradition of modern art in the earlier period. They don't necessarily, you know, identify beauty strictly with the kind of specific, you know, classical norm. But there is the idea in the modern art that what you're doing is, you know, through these techniques, you're really getting at the kind of underlying, you know, essences of nature, even beyond the kind of contingent appearances of things. And so when you know, render color, you're kind of you're keyed into these certain color harmonies, certain kind of differentials that are inherently harmonious, almost like music, something like that. And they are kind of transcendently beautiful in a way that's comparable to that later classical norm. At the same time, what that actually translates into in practice are figures that have more lively faces. They're often kind of, there is a tendency over the course of the 14th century to kind of focus on these young, beautiful faces, and that becomes the kind of arena in which the painters are exploring with these color harmonies. And that creates a certain degree of confusion because that more casual viewer might look at a painter of, the 1370s, 80s, half century after Giotto, and say, this is more beautiful, more modern, because the figure is more fashionable, the haircut is more like, the fashionable haircuts of my time. And that would then irk these kinds of intellectuals who would say, no, actually, the beauty of modern art resides in these transcendent colors.
So before we run out of time, let me ask you one last question that I'm really curious to hear your answer here. There are a lot of firsts that are always connected to Giotto's name, and one of these is described as the first Italian artist, right? He's being praised already really early on for having furnished Italy with his works at a time in which Italy was far from being a unified country. And it is true that the spread of his work is actually pretty sizable for an artist of that time, and this even grows to a much larger extent with his school, right? The Giottesque is really everywhere in Italy. Pupils of Giotto are everywhere in the 14th century. So let me ask you about the Italianness of Giotto. Is this being described as Italian, as the first truly Italian artist? Is it something that has conditioned his perception across the century, that has conditioned somehow or shaped his being modern? Is that relevant at all in the discussion?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think perhaps from the early stages, it has to do with the choice of that term modern. There were these other kind of authoritative traditions. The modern art that Giotto founded is always defined in relation to the Greek Byzantine tradition that preceded it, which was enormously prestigious throughout the 13th century and into Giotto's youth. It's also kind of defined with the omission of kind of Northern Gothic traditions, which, looking back on it now, our historians can say were enormously important for the development of art in that period in Italy. But it's interesting that when they discuss those other traditions, they always use these kind of geographical terms like Greek or, Northern or whatnot. Mm-hmm. But when they're describing themselves, it's modern. And I think there is potentially an act of kind of appropriation, conscious or not, that results in this kind of universalization of a specifically Italian art because of the fact that they're defining it in terms of time rather than space. Once you've established yourself as, as kind of holding the reins of your time, by implication, the other traditions are already something of the
anachronistic.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for answering all these questions, but most importantly, thank you for a wonderful new contribution to our field of studies, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks so much, Francesca.